the actual circumstance in life, we can't possibly expect to be able to avoid. Sure, we might be able to theoretically say, oh, I could have avoided that situation. But the truth is that life is situations. And if it's not one situation, it's another situation. So hopefully, what we can start to see is that situations are inevitable in life. And some situations are going to be pleasurable, and some situations are going to be painful. And a situation is pleasurable or painful based on how the situation is, what it delivers in relation to the human being's biological preferences. If the situation is in line with the human's biological preferences, then it's going to be pleasure, and we can call that biological pleasure. And if the situation is painful relative to the biological preferences, then the situation is painful. And in the flow of life, which really means the circumstance we find ourselves in, the situation we find ourselves in, being sometimes pleasure or sometimes pain, depending on how it is relative to our preferences, we can see that you can have different sorts of pleasure and pains. In general terms, we can categorize the pleasure and pains into categories of sensational or physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure or pain, or financial pleasure or pain. Physical pleasure or pain is if you get in the shower and the water isn't hot and it's really cold and it's a cold winter's day, then you would say that is not in line with the body's preferences, having a cold shower. And the preference in this case, the situation in this case, has to do with the body senses. So it's a form of physical pain in the moment. If, on the other hand, it's a cold day and you get into the shower and it's nice and warm and you get to relax under the warmth of the water, you can see it is physical pleasure. If you open up your wallet and the money that you had in there is missing, that's financial pain, not in line with your preferences. If you open, or if you put on an old pair of jeans and put your hand in the pocket and there's $100, that's financial pleasure. If you're booking an airline ticket and you say, oh, I'll do that tomorrow, you select the ticket you want and you say, tomorrow I'll finalize the booking, and you go back tomorrow and the price has gone up $300. That's financial pain. Financial pain in the moment because of the circumstance. You could just as easily have turned on the computer and the price may have dropped, and that would have been financial pleasure. And if you find out that someone that you care about has died, for example, or is in pain, that emotional pain for you, it's not your preference to hear about someone that you care about in pain or in a troublesome situation, or if someone you care about died, you can feel emotional pain. And if someone turns up that you haven't seen for a long time that you like, that's emotional pleasure. If someone shouts at you, you can say that's emotional pain. It's not your preference. And so if someone tells you that you haven't been very helpful or haven't been a great friend, then you much rather they were giving you a compliment or telling you something pleasurable. That might be emotional pleasure if they say you've been very helpful, and emotional pain if they say, look, you haven't been very helpful. Now, the pain in life is part and parcel of the circumstance and the biological reaction to the circumstance. And that biological reaction is based on the preferences of the body, and the preferences of the body are part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning of the body. Two factors that man wasn't in control of. The human being is essentially the result of the growth of the genes and how life has affected the genetic growth, which we can call new conditioning in each moment. And the new conditioning is part of the up-to-date conditioning, which is one with the genetic organism. So we are in each moment one way, according to our genetic structure and how that was influenced by life moment after moment after moment up to this very point in time. And that genetic structure is always in flux because life is always delivering new conditioning that can change the up-to-date conditioning. And we know that the organism itself, the genetic organism, is growing. We're putting food into it. It's digesting the food. It's taking the energy out of the food. So the human being is always in flux. But it's always a result of these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning. Two factors we've never been in control of. And part of that structure that exists in each moment includes the biological preferences. And so escaping circumstance, escaping situation, escaping pleasure or pain is not an option in life. The amount of pleasure and pain that we will experience is, we can say, destined as part of the story of life. Not in our control, because we're clearly not in control of how the others act. We're not in control about natural events or economic events. We're not in control of our health or the health of the others. So circumstance is going to unfold always one way in each moment. And we can say it's inevitable, and therefore the amount of pleasure and pain that we experience in our life is part of the story of life. So all this to say that we can't escape circumstance, and life is circumstance, and that means life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. What can be a significant recognition in our journey towards the evolution of our humanness is to realize that there is another layer on top of the biological response to circumstance. There is another layer of experience that exists on top of the circumstantial layer of experience of life. And that layer of experience that is additional to the circumstantial, which includes the pleasure and pain of circumstance, is our attitude to the circumstance. And our attitude to the circumstance is also governed by the same general factors that govern the biological response to the circumstance. That is our genes and up-to-date conditioning. However, the attitude to circumstance is governed by a very specific type of up-to-date conditioning, a very specific portion of your up-to-date conditioning. And it's our attitude to circumstance that determines whether we have a load of psychological suffering added on top of the pleasure or pain of the circumstance, or whether the circumstance, which is either pleasure or pain, is accompanied by peace of mind. And peace of mind simply means the absence of the load, the psychological load of suffering. And whether we realize it or not, the uncomfortableness with oneself, the uncomfortableness with life, the sense that things aren't quite right yet, the sense that drives us to seek specific outcomes, the sense that forces us to resist life when it is not in line with our expectations, the attitude that forces us to blame ourselves and blame the other and feel pride, is a very specific attitude to circumstance. So what is the attitude that humans have that forces this extra load of suffering to accompany the inevitable pleasure or pain of life? What is the attitude to life? And the answer is that it's the attitude of personal doership and attachment to which forces this additional load of suffering to be piled on top of the inevitable pleasure and pain of circumstance. And what does the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome really means? What it means is that there is a part of the human being that has, so the human being has developed from conception up to this very point in time. And within that structure, within that instrument that is the human being, that entity that is the human being, there is a psychological sense of self that has set in. The psychological sense of self is how we know ourselves. And how we know ourselves is very linked to how we see life and what we know life as. And essentially, the human being tends to have a false idea, a false set of beliefs put in place by life as part of its structure that forces it to have this very specific attitude to one and the other in life that causes the suffering. And the good news is that that ingrained sense of self is based on an error, based on a seeing life through a particular lens. And if it's destined, that lens can fall away, which really means that we then will see life and ourself differently. And if we see ourself and life differently, it means the psychological sense of self, the false psychological me, has dissolved. And that's good to seeing things with clarity, a self-realization, realizing the true self rather than having a psychological idea of oneself. So one of the analogies that can be used to demonstrate how we can have an idea of ourselves that may not be in line with the thing itself is to introduce the notion of gravity, the theory of gravity, as opposed to gravity itself. So we can read about the theory of gravity. Someone can tell us about the theory of gravity. We can hold a theory of gravity in our intellect. And we might have misunderstood the theory of gravity and hold it in our intellect, or we might have the theory of gravity quite accurate in our intellect. Whether we have it accurate or inaccurate isn't so much the point. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that we can have a theory about something which is not the thing itself. So gravity exists and functions, operates in life, independent of science's theory about gravity. The theory of gravity is essentially a description of the forces at play. And if we deleted the theory of gravity from mankind, gravity would continue to function. And what happened is, in the development of the human, is because we're thinking all the time, because it is a function of the human being, we can sometimes mistake our thinking about something as the thing itself. Because we tend to know objects in life through our thinking. The intellect is a very impressive tool, a very part of the human being. And it's so impressive and so active that we've come to only know life through the faculty of thought. And because we experience life through the faculty of thought, and it creates an experience, we can sometimes overlook the fact that we're experiencing our idea of the thing rather than the thing itself. And if the only way that we remember experiencing through our idea about something, our impression, our opinion, our view, we may actually realize that that is a psychological experience of oneself or the other or life. It's actually a direct appreciation of life. And so part of the movement is for us to realize that there is the thing itself, and then our thought about the thing. And spiritual teachings are always encouraging us to know something truly. And so it describes that which gets in the way of us knowing something truly. So often the teachings are pointing to thinking, saying, your thinking is the problem. Your thinking is the veil that prevents you from knowing the truth. And what happens is often it is the thinking that hears that, the thinking that pointer, and then we try to think our way into the freedom that is being spoken about. Not realizing yet again that the freedom that is being spoken about is the ceasing of the thinking. And here we are, not realizing that the more we think about the problem, the more the problem is being reinforced. All the while, here we are thinking about how we're going to solve the problem, believing that we might actually be getting closer to solving the problem by actively thinking about it. And the teachings will keep saying, you can't think your way out of the problem. The problem is the thinking. Now, that's not absolutely true. However, at a certain formation of the human being, it's completely obsessive, and that there is no capacity to know life without thought being the filter through which life is known. The teachings will make these statements, which are statements that hopefully one day will create a flash of understanding that, what they're saying is it is the thinking about life that is obscuring the direct knowing of life. And only at the moment when everything lines up perfectly is there the flash of insight that says, stop. And it doesn't even say stop, it is the stopping, which is essentially in that moment, everything coming together, that maybe before the stop, there is a last flash of thought that says, it's saying the problem is the thinking, and therefore the thinking has to stop. And in that moment, we might experience life completely differently to how it has been experienced up to that point in time. Because up to that point in time, there was a habituated movement that says the way that life is lived is by the awareness of life and the simultaneous judgment and comparison and assessment of what that means about me. And all of that happens automatically because it isn't being done by someone that is doing it wrong. It is the functioning of a machine that has grown to function that way. And life is saying there's another way to be in life. And so the very act of life putting that information forward through films, through music, through teachings, through books, the very act of that happening is life setting up the play such that the other way may click, may present itself. And in the contrast between the active thinking about life, which really means seeing it through a layer of thought, between that and the contrast of where that falls away, that's when it's revealed, oh, there's a completely different way of knowing life. And that's often referred to as silence. The silence of the thinking mind, where circumstance can happen. And in the circumstance, there's the biological reaction, which is part of the circumstance and the body interacting with the circumstance. But there doesn't need to be, and there isn't a commentary about it. There is just the direct appreciation of the experience of the thing itself without the attitude to it. And what tends to happen is when the attitude to the circumstance kicks in, as soon as the circumstance happens, the circumstance is essentially downplayed and overruled or overshadowed. And what we experience of life is our attitude to circumstance. And if our attitude to the circumstance is always picking out what is wrong or what is missing, we might realize that we're really not experiencing much of life, but rather our attitude is finding those things in the moment, not according to expectation, and then creating a whole story that fills the experience with the story about the thing that's not right. So all of this is to point out that we can have thing itself and a thought about the thing itself. And the thought about the thing itself can be misguided. So if we say there is life, the present moment, and then we have an attitude to an aspect of the present moment, and that attitude fills the space, we then have an experience of life that is a very narrow, you could say, experience of life. And what's more, it's an experience of life when there is a focus on even the negative aspect, which might be quite small about life. And then within that, it's what that means about me, which may actually be based on a false idea of who you are. So that whole attitude is permeated with an uncomfortableness, and essentially how we experience life, what we know of life. And we might not realize that this is happening. It's just our experience as it's always been. It may well have become normalized because there's been no contrast to it. So we're asked to come and feel the circumstance, and don't necessarily go straight into the commentary. So how does coming into the body help? When we have this attitude towards life, we could say that we're caught in above the shoulders, caught in the head. And it still feels like we're living life because it's filled with the story about life, and how and what it means about me, the way that it's unfolding. What does that mean about me? So life is filled with an experience, but it's this above the shoulders experience. So if we're asked to come into the body and feel, we're being prompted and pointed to come into a new appreciation of life, meaning new components of the experience that in the old way, or the above shoulders way, make up a very small part of the experience because the narrative about that takes over. And so if we are directed into the body, below, come out of the head into here, we might find how an appreciation of how absent we are from feeling life. And there is feeling moment after moment after moment. And we're very habituated to go off into the thinking. And so to keep coming back, knowing that there always is something to feel, even if the feeling is, you can, when you look at a tree or a flower or another person or a car picture, that can be considered feeling if it is being looked at with presence, which really just means appreciating it for its sensational value. And that sensation, the response to the sensation, can be felt. And the more we're interested in feeling, the more time is spent on feeling and the less time spent going into the attitude and the narrative. So the silent attitude, the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment, essentially means the experience of life, the feeling of life is what's happening. And the presence of the attitude means a feeling of life happens in a particular moment, and often it's the painful feelings of life, or when we see something that we have some sort of issue with, and narrative takes over and extends horizontally in time. And so we might be thinking about the circumstance that happened 15 or 20 minutes ago, or 3 days ago, or 3 years ago. That thought is happening horizontally in time, which really means we're now not thinking about something in this current experience, but having dragged an old experience into the present moment in our attitude towards it. So all of this discussion stemmed from talking about how we can have a false sense of self and miss what we truly are. And in order to highlight how we can have a false sense of self, it's important to talk about how we can have a mental image about something and mistake that mental image for the thing itself. So when we have this attitude about life as it happened even 10 minutes ago, we have essentially dragged a mental image of what happened 10 minutes ago into the present moment, which is obscuring the present moment. And we might think we're living life, but we're really living the idea of life that happened 10 minutes ago. And so this sense, the false sense of self, is related to that. It's an idea of who I am, which is an idea taken based on an observation of ourself. And that idea then becomes very solidified and ingrained. So an example of that is, I am the best, or I am the worst. It's an idea, a belief about yourself. Now that idea or belief is very rarely accurate, and it's never the thing itself. At best, it's a view of yourself from a very particular perspective. And so as soon as we run with our idea of ourselves, we reduce ourselves down to the scope of our idea of ourselves. And furthermore, if some significant characteristics are left out or added in. We have a false sense of ourself. Now, even if it was a relatively accurate sense of ourself, idea of ourself, belief of ourself, that still is quite an unfortunate way of living life, because we know ourselves at a distance from what we really are, meaning we're interacting with an idea of ourself instead of just being. So it's very important to recognize that we can have an idea of ourself that can keep us disconnected from the core of who we are. The idea of myself creates a second me in a way. At least it creates the experience of a second me. There is the I, the thing itself, the actual Roger. And if I have an idea of myself, then there is the phantom Roger. And that phantom Roger can take center stage, obscuring the actual essence of who we are. So the false idea that we have about ourselves is, I am the orchestrator of my life, and that my happiness is dependent on life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Now, they're two very unfortunate errors, because one, it forces us to feel like we are controlling everything that's happening in life, and then forced to see the other as the controller of things that are happening in life. And secondly, it forces us to seek the perfect life. It forces us to imagine the need to be a perfect person. So hopefully you can confirm this for yourself, that if you look at the deeply ingrained patterning, even if it's changing, if you look back at the remnants of the deeply ingrained pattern, or you remember, or you see what is still quite strong in you, you'll see that there is an assumption in life, a way of automatically relating to those things that happen through me and those things that happen through the other. If I am the doer and I should have done it differently, as if the other is the doer and they should have done it differently. And that is our attitude towards the circumstance. So the circumstance happens and I don't know, drop the food on the floor. And so there is this great sense of shame about not having done it good enough. Now, the fact is, the food fell on the floor and it's a painful circumstance, not in line with one's preferences. And that's just the unfortunateness of life sometimes. That's the inevitable circumstance, the inevitable situation. The attitude comes up and says, I did that, and I am the one that could have done it differently. And furthermore, and it is my completeness and my happiness that is dependent on it having turned out differently. Whereas the truth of the matter is, when we see life more clearly, is that life is happening and the body is part of life and it's automatic. And yes, the body did drop the plate of food on the floor. But the body is not something that could do things differently to the way that it does things. The idea that the body could do things differently is a psychological idea that includes in it a misinterpretation of how life works. It's no different to saying, the car, when everything was a certain way, should have been flickering the left indicator light and not the right indicator light. Now, we know if it's flickering the right indicator light, not the left, it's because the car is designed in that moment to do that. Now, that might include um, a wire that has broken or a short that has happened. But the car didn't create that mishap. If it's a mishap, so let's say the right indicator is flashing when in fact you've flicked the lever, the indicator switch, such that the left should be flashing. Now, if the right is flashing, we can have the idea that says, oh, that's strange. The right is flashing, whereas the left should be flashing. Can have that idea, but if we are judging it and saying, it should be different, we're not realizing that the right is flashing because the car is structured in that moment for the right to be flashing. It couldn't happen unless the car was structured for that to happen. And the human being ideally would always work according to an ideal. But the fact is that we're not designed to be perfect. And so this attitude that says, I could have and should have done it differently, is an attitude that might seem to make sense based on how we look at it. But when we see that the human being, including the thoughts that we are so convinced are my thoughts, which is what makes it feel like, well, I could have paid more attention. And this I could have paid more attention is simply a theoretical assessment how attention comes about. The fact is there is no me doer that creates how much attention there is or there isn't. And the belief in personal doership is so strong. The belief in personal doership says, of course, there is a me that is in control of where my attention goes. And the reason that it feels like there is a me in control of where our attention goes is because sometimes more attention is placed on something. And more attention is placed on something and an accident doesn't happen. And so then in a moment when less attention is placed on something and an accident happens, we know of the time when more attention is available and the accident doesn't happen. And so we see that in this moment, the accident happened because there was less attention. And then we say, oh, I should have and I could have put more attention on it simply because we know of times when more attention is available. But that doesn't prove that there is a me doer. It just means that sometimes the instrument functions with attention and other times it functions without attention. Now, why? Just like the car that flickers the light, the wrong light, because in that moment, the wiring is a particular way. And so the human being has less attention because it's a very complex machine and someone might be talking to us. And so our attention is limited. And so we might be listening to the talking and therefore our attention on something is not present, is not there. And that was forced to be the case by the fact that the circumstance, which is out of our control, included someone talking to us. So the more we can appreciate that the human being is a very complex instrument with its limitations, and it's always functioning exactly the way it's designed to function, then we might see the attitude towards life, which is the attitude of shame and guilt, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance, that is based on the assumption that I could have been different, that the other could have been different. We might realize how uncomfortable that is, that extra, that layer, how it adds a whole extra layer of suffering on top of the inevitable pleasure or pain of the circumstance. And as we see this, as we start to appreciate it in our own life. So today I was talking to a friend and they said, it was a couple, and they said, we realize how much we complain. And the realization of how much we complain is a significant step to that complaining being reduced. Because the realization came with the seeing that the complaining colors life a certain way. So realizing that there's this attitude of personal doership that is adding this load of guilt and shame, and this load of blame and hatred, and this load of pride and arrogance onto the circumstance means that it can be, one, known, that's what it is. Hopefully we can see that there is no doer doing it. It's just a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And in time, we might find that a part of the body says, that's enough of that. You've already been doing it for 10 seconds. 10 seconds is more than enough. The complaining aspect is linked to attachment to outcomes, where we believe that our happiness is to be found in life being perfect, pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And as we start to appreciate that the flow of life is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, never going to be exactly the way we want it, that the flow of life is predetermined by innumerable factors out of our control. And when that's understood and it's seen that complaining about the present moment just adds an extra layer of uncomfortableness, then the complaining might stop. It means, sure, neighbors are making a lot of noise at an early hour in the morning. That's the pain of the circumstance. And if the complaining comes in, we find that that's an extra load of uncomfortableness on top of the fact that you've been woken up at 4 in the morning. So that's the human suffering that Buddha referred to, that can come to an end. And Buddha made it very simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is attachment. And Buddha also said that events happen, deeds are done, but there is no individual doer thereof. If the belief in the individual doer falls away, then what is seen is life is happening. Events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, life is happening. There is no doer to claim responsibility over what has happened. That doesn't absolve the person from responsibility to society. Consequences will still happen. So saying I'm not the doer is not some sort of magical excuse. It's not going to save you from the consequence of the actions that happen through you. What it will do is the recognition of it, the deep recognition that there simply cannot be a doer, will mean load of guilt and blame and pride falls away. And that's not something that you can pretend, because someone can say, oh, I see that there is no doer. And then they say, and yet I still feel guilty. And so I'd say, well, in that case, you don't really see there's no doer, which is not a criticism. It's just a simple deduction based on what's being described. If the guilt arises, it means that the belief in personal doership hasn't been dissolved. Someone says, but I understand there is no doer. I go, okay, so this is, it means that there is some understanding penetrating into the system. It means you understand it intellectually. You understand the theory of it. And now that understanding needs to go deeper and deeper and deeper until the deepening understanding uproots the deeply ingrained misunderstanding of personal doership. And when that misunderstanding is uprooted, the guilt and the blame won't arise. That's when we can say, oh, I really understand that there is no doer. And the understanding is not referring to uh, a, an intellectual understanding that can be repeated back, for example. It is referring to a deep seeing that everything that happens, including the thinking and the emotions, are a result of the growth of the human being, that the human being wasn't in control. The human being is the movements of the human being are outputs. And the circumstance, which includes the outputs, are a feedback loop into the and a part of the new conditioning that life's delivering that becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning. So in each moment, the human being is an output of life. And when that's really seen, the thought may come up, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And it'll get cut off very quickly. It's like, I couldn't have functioned any differently. And when it's total, the thought, I shouldn't have done that, just won't come up. There will be an appreciation for the fact that the circumstance hasn't turned out favorably. There won't be a denying of that. And there won't be a denying that this body-mind was part of the events that led to the negative circumstance. That will also be appreciated. But psychologically, it's like, yes, that all happened. And it's not fortunate. We could say it's unfortunate. But attitudinally, I can't expect it to have been different. Only if we see that life is always unfolding exactly as it's destined. And so this is the peace of mind that's available to the human being. And the peace of mind kicks in when we realize there really is no doer. I simply cannot be the doer. Life is happening. And why is this so significant? Because the narrative, the psychological movement that is based on the belief in personal doership is what really makes life unacceptable and unbearable. And as that falls away, we find that the heaviness, the load of guilt and blame and pride and worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome falls away. and a whole lifetime of that load can fall away. So let's take some questions. Hi, Gregor.
Hi, Roger. Hi.
Hi.
I'm asking, my question is, you often say that thoughts just pop up, that they have no, that they just arise out of the nothing. Do I understand you correctly? That you often said that, or at least I heard it like that.
I wouldn't say I often say that. I put that perspective in as one way of seeing thoughts. So we can say thoughts come out of nowhere is one view. The other view is thoughts come from the brain, which is not nowhere. And the brain is a machine designed by life. And in practical terms, we can say the brain is a result of our date conditioning. So there are two different perspectives of explaining thoughts. One is the thought just pops out of nowhere in consciousness as an object. And the other is looking at it more causally. And in both situations, whichever one you resonate with, the point is that there's no one doing it. There's no me doer, but rather the thought happening.
Yeah. Because I was thinking about composers, directors, book writers. You couldn't write a book just by not reading what you have read, what you have wrote a minute ago, and get something, get a book done. So I was wondering how this process then is working. But yeah.
Well, actually, strangely enough, it's artists that would have a very strong appreciation of the fact that creativity is definitely not a function of the the egotistical part of the human being. Artists tend to find that they produce their best work when they're not there, and when they find that the art or the creativity flows. So Ramesh, my teacher, used to write paragraph after paragraph and then just not make any changes, and no need to make many edits or anything like that, because once he got in the flow, the writing seemed to come from somewhere more pure, more creative, let's say, than when there's someone there worried about whether they're getting it right, whether it's good enough or not. And so that's what so that's when it's experienced as being a flow from, let's say, a spontaneous flow. Another example is Nijinsky, the dancer. Ramesh used to use this example. He said, one time Nijinsky said, Nijinsky dances best when Nijinsky's not there. So what it's really pointing at is the doership, and the doer, the one worrying about the outcomes, that thoughts come in life through the body, but there is no doer of the thoughts. They arise and you don't know what your next thought is going to be. And you don't, and so the same, the thought that has arisen came, and it could have been anything.
Yeah, okay, I understand that. That makes sense to me. But still, I mean, if you are a scientist and you are having a new theory on gravity, you need a flow of thought to get this new theory written down. So I was just referring to this you mentioning popping up, which I did not understand, but which I do understand better now. Thank you.
Right, but also the popping up doesn't just mean without continuity. For example, when we see, if you look at thoughts and from a meditation point of view, let's say, where there is a witnessing of thinking, that's when the statement is often made that thoughts arise in consciousness. So if there's a witnessing of the thinking process, all we see is this flow of thoughts. We don't really see where they are coming from. There is just this flow of thoughts in the present moment. And the flow of thought could be a whole story about, a novel, a poem, a theory. So even Einstein made the statement when he came up with the theory of E equals mc squared. He said, "It came to me from outside." It's when he stopped trying to get the answer came to him from outside. So even in scientific and something that requires and looking back and adjusting, the sense can still be that this thinking, this creating, even the working mind, calculating, is a happening and not my doing. So that's really what it's pointing out, that we assume that I had to do it in order for it to be to come up with something valuable, something that makes sense. That couldn't have just come out of nowhere. I had to do it. And this idea of I as a doer is what the teaching is superfluous. Maybe life can create amazing things without you needing to be the one having created them.
Okay, thank you. I would have another question, if it is permitted, because many people are waiting maybe. And this would be, who are you actually talking to? Are you talking to the working mind, to the thinking mind, to source? If you are a teacher, to whom are you talking? Or to which instance are you talking?
Well, we can either say that we're talking to the doer. That's one perspective of looking at teachings. They are talking to the doer, because if the doer wasn't there, the teacher would have nothing to say. So the teaching is only relevant when the doership is in place, when the false belief of who we are is in place. More accurately, I think I'm talking to the working mind. And who is talking is another working mind. There isn't really a Roger as a separate independent entity talking to a Gregor as a separate independent entity. There is life functioning through this body-mind organism, and we can say that this speaking, because it's coherent and it's functional, is part of the working mind. And that working mind is throwing out new information so even if I was giving directions to a shop that you've never been to that's round the corner, if I'm talking to Gregor, I'm throwing out new conditioning that I very much understand can change Gregor's up-to-date conditioning so that he can get to the shop that previously, before the information was there, he may not have been able to get to the shop. So we can look at it like that. The instrument is throwing out information that can change another instrument and get them to function differently.
Thank you. That was a very good answer.
That requires no doer in that, right? It's just about learning machines and information.
Yeah. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Gregor. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. Thank you for your new conditioning.
You're welcome.
And yesterday you said you used the phrase field of awareness.
Right.
And this just, it was amazing because it just clicked in me, and it allowed me to be more free in seeing the contraction of my idea of myself.
Right. Okay.
It just allowed me relaxing, and this was the wonderful. And then in the same context, I also heard Rupert talking about that our true nature is not disturbed by object.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this was such an amazing combination, because most of my life I was always trying to avoid disturbances in my life. I mean, I always pulled myself out of the, I tried to pull myself out of the flow of life in order to have a certain insight or something. And then seeing that I can just relax, because my true nature is always here. I don't need to change my thinking. I don't need to change anything. It was just beautiful, and I still feel very calm, and it just, it just deeply resonates. That's all.
Very, very good. Yeah, the field of awareness is, it creates a sense of a container, I think, that all of the experience arises inside this field, this space. And what arises in there can be anything. You know, you can be angry and the space holds it. You can be excited and the space holds it. There can be loud noise and the space holds it. And the more we know ourselves as that space, the witnessing, the formless, the less important the content becomes, because we see the content arises and it subsides. It's replaced by something else very quickly. So it also links in with the Rumi poem. There is a, there is a field out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing. I'll meet you there. And when the soul lies down in the grass of that field, life is so full that nothing needs to be said, or something along those lines. And that field beyond the ideas of right and wrong is the dropping of our identification with the content as being good or bad, and this is how it should be and shouldn't be. And resting as the field of awareness, as I see it. And that is then when the soul lies in the grass of that field, which really means when we drop back into our beingness, or being that field, life is too full to even talk about, which really means we know that we are complete, that nothing needs to change, that the circumstances not as relevant. There is a direct sense of contentment and completeness in resting in that field. So I don't know if that's the sense you got with this field of awareness, but that's something that's what I mean by it. So but anyway, either way, you said it had a good effect, so that's nice.
Yes, I can resonate with this idea of the field. I mean, gosh, I have such a hard time. I hear myself, and I have this also when I see myself. There's such a disconnect often between who I really feel inside and the one that I see in the world. I mean, this is amazing. There's so much judgment and so much harshness often. Like I'm looking at a stranger. But I got distracted right now. At one point you said there needs to be a trust, or there is a trusting in the biological intelligence of us. And you, this was in context with a question if God is benevolent. And you escaped in a way the answer that God is benevolent by just pointing on trusting the biological intelligence. Is there, why do you distinguish between the creator being benevolent and biological intelligence? Yeah, okay, sorry.
Well, I guess I don't see a creator as a creator anymore. I don't see God in any sense like we tend to, humans tend to have an idea of God that is very much based on a separate sense of self. And so the notion of benevolence is very much an aspect of a conceptual God that comes from a very specific sense of self. So I mean, I don't know why we would possibly think of God as benevolent. I mean, I don't even think there is a God in the sense of when someone says, is God benevolent? I don't think there is even a God that matches the question of, is God benevolent? Because it implies a God. What is the God that you are asking about?
Yes, I see. So then I'm using the word benevolent in a wrong way. I just mean then God, to me, God is just the cause of the phenomena of life. And that there's just a harmony in it. I mean, I don't need to defend myself. I don't need to protect myself. I don't need to freak out about circumstances. This is what I mean with benevolent.
Yes. Well, in that case, yes. But I mean, clearly we can look at circumstance and see that it's not always pleasurable. It's not always ideal. So let's say a family and they have a young child that dies, or a handicapped child is born, accidents happen, people get discriminated against, there's acts of violence and cruelty. So when we look at life, we can hardly say life is safe as an absolute comment. And yet, because of our deeper nature, the part of the human being that is, you could say, untouched by all of the circumstance that we go through, because in each of our lives there are going to be those times when things happen that are not ideal, not pleasurable, and yet there is this part inside of us that is not actually so affected, so touched by the circumstance. And so to that part of ourself, then God can be benevolent because God has created an aspect of ourself that is untouched. So we can say, oh, well, that was the benevolent God that has created me in such a way that on a deep level, I'm untouched by life. So, you know, it really depends where your perspective is as to whether there's benevolence. But I do really think you can trust life, which really means just if we find the part of ourself that feels okay with life as it is, then as we rest there, we are trusting life because the non-trust is not active. And
Wonderful.
so someone might say, well, why are you trusting life if you know these things can happen? And I guess it's like, well, when they happen, I will deal with it. And there is a knowing that even when these things happen, if they happen, they don't touch the deeper part of who I am.
It's so amazing because, I mean, I'm now, I think, 53, and most of my life I just struggled. I mean, I was uncomfortable in myself. I was trapped in this pleasure seeking. I was depressed and frustrated, and I mean, it's so amazing to just listen to your to effortlessly listen to your new conditioning that you're distributing here, and to see how this works. This is amazing. This is beautiful. And it's so ridiculous. If I look at my person, there's such a humility and shame and guilt and blame in myself. It's unbelievable. I mean, no wonder that I couldn't enjoy life.
Mm-hmm. And you weren't doing that, right? That was destined for you to experience life that way. It was forced upon you. So you can even relax from the self-judgment about having been like that.
Thank you. I hear you. Yes, I have to. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, but I'm very. It's very nice to hear that there's positive change. I have so much faith in the process. Actually, just knowing that a repetition just wears down layer over layer over layer, and the change does start to be felt. So that's why I'm feeling very encouraged by the fact that people are tuning in daily in some cases for extended periods of time, because it really is how the change happens.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger.
Hi, Paul.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I have a question based on an earlier talk that you had given that I was listening to again.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about, in Ramesh's teaching that you embrace the paradox that, the way the teaching is presented embraces the paradox that while there is no free will, there is the subjective experience of free will. The person feels like the doer in the moment, although upon reflection, they know that they're not the doer. And then you were saying that some people might have a teaching that, so if someone was too fatalistic, there might be a different teacher who would have a teaching emphasizing the free will component. But then you said also there could be, on the other side, teaching that emphasize the non-doership to the point of eliminating the paradox, the sense of the paradox, or not acknowledging that, like on the one extreme, for a particular individual, someone might have a teaching that emphasized the sense of free will in order to counteract an error where the person just was passively fatalistic or something along those lines. And that the other extreme could also exist in the teaching for a particular purpose. But I was trying to reflect what that other extreme would be like. I mean, what would be the teaching theoretically that would emphasize the non-doership and not acknowledge the paradox of the person having the experience of doership?
So I wouldn't, if we're going to have a chat about this particular topic, it's important to get some words right, because it's very easy to interchange, for example, doership and free will. And I think they need to be made distinguished as quite different, because they're talking about two different layers that are different, and one remains and one falls away. And so the free will in this discussion is talking about a feeling of free will. And you can have a feeling of free will that doesn't equate with the belief in personal doership. Because the belief of personal doership is on the attitudinal level, and the feeling of free will is part of the circumstantial level. So if you've become clear that a feeling doesn't necessarily represent truth, then what can happen is you can feel something and not believe it. And yet, if you are feeling it and not believing it, there is still the effect of the feeling it. So what that's saying is that there is a feeling of free will, which says, I am free to do whatever I want. And that's undeniable. That feeling of free will exists all the time for everyone. And anyone who feels unrestricted, unless they're actually, handcuffed by or being held by someone in a circumstance, then the feeling of free will is limited, but it's still free. In that moment, you can spit on the people, or you can shout, and you have that free will. It's just that your options are limited, but you still have free will in the moment to do whatever the circumstance permits you to do. So shout, for example. And so when I'm pointing at the feeling of free will, it's not the same as the belief in personal doership, because the belief in personal doership is what you're referring to. When someone reflects on it, they see that the shouting was a result of the circumstance. They wouldn't have shouted if the circumstance was different. And their particular genes and up-to-date conditioning. If they were a completely different person, maybe extremely timid by nature, they might not shout. And so the thing that someone is not the doer is understanding the principle behind the mechanics. The feeling of free will exists even given that the principle is life is a happening, and that the shouting happened. The feeling of free will is undeniably there. Even when we recognize that the mechanics are that I can only function one way, which really, from another perspective says I have no choice, because choice implies one of two ways, let's say, or one of many ways, and the understanding can be I can only function one way. So they're really on two levels. One is the experience, which is the feeling of free will, and the other is the attitude or the understanding of the dynamics, let's say, the understanding of the mechanics. And so you can have the feeling of free will simultaneous to the deep, deep knowing that I'm not the doer. So doership and free will are not really the same thing. Now, I haven't answered the question, which I will, but I'll ask you if what I've said makes sense first. And the part I haven't answered is, how can someone go to the other extreme of not understanding the paradox when so what would the other extreme be of not understanding the paradox? And I'll address that in a second. So was the first part of my clarifying the difference between the feeling of free will and the belief in personal doership? Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's very clear the way you laid that out. Thank you.
Right. So what can happen in some teachings is that because the problem really is the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, a teaching will come along and say, you have no free will, because they're not interested in the feeling of free will. That will just complicate things. What they really want to do is create a shift in the mind, in the thinking, that starts to believe and recognize that free will, the notion of free will, which is not how I've been using it, but the notion that I am a separate doer or I am the doer, is the error, is not true. And instead of using the word doership, they'll call that free will, because typically in the English language, free will has referred to I am a sovereign human being that is in control of everything I do. That's what free will generally means, or implies. And so a spiritual teaching will say, you have no free will. It doesn't exist. It's an illusion. And I agree. That's like me saying there is no doership. There is no doer. It's just that I've put in this nuance of free will. So we're talking about the teachings that are really trying to just break this belief of doership. And generally speaking, they'll come in and say, there is no free will. Everything is just happening spontaneously. And there is no creator, or at least the character is not the creator of what happens. And that can click for someone. It's like they can see it, especially if they're in a position of some of the modern Advaita or non-duality teachings are really emphasizing just the present moment. This is it, and that everything is just happening in this moment. And that can create a witnessing where thoughts are seen as to just arising in this present moment and subsiding. Words are arising in this present moment and subsiding. And from that perspective, when someone sees there is no no agent of the thoughts, no agent of the words or the actions, then it clicks. Like there is no free will. There is no free will. Everything is just spontaneous happening. Now, that can seem quite positive, and it is to some extent, because the deeply ingrained belief of doership has, in a sort of moment of awakening, been seen to be false, because the causality that we assume is how life happens has been challenged by the notion that everything is spontaneously arising. So the question of time the reality of time is diminished in that teaching. The reality of causality is diminished, all with some fairly significant results, where people wake up and see all there is this moment, and it's all just appearance, and none of it is real. And it can collapse into the equivalent of deep sleep, let's say, in any moment. And in fact, that's what the experience is doing. It's continually changing. And the sense of a person is part of the changing experience, and the thoughts are part of the changing experience. And it just appears like thoughts are coming from the human being, but actually it's all just being flashed onto the screen as one big layer of objects, or one singular flash of experience. So the agency and causality, which reinforces agency, falls away. And so someone might say, well, what's the problem with that? Isn't that liberation? Isn't that liberation from the doer? Isn't that liberation from the person? I go, there's the problem. Because what has happened in that exploration is that now even the person is seen to be non-existent, because all of life, which is really being reduced down to this present moment, is seen to be just an apparent appearance in the moment, which technically it is. And so that seeker has now become more interested in the nature of life as experience. And attention is no longer really on the content. The content is sort of seen to be irrelevant. It's who cares what the content is? What's important is to recognize life as experience registered by awareness. And what I am is awareness. And I'm not talking about what Roger, the ones saying those words, but to that seeker, there has been a sort of an awakening, and the sense is, the qualitative sense of the experience is, I am formless awareness, and everything is spontaneously arising. There's no free will. There's no person to have free will. And life is an illusion. It's all a joke. None of that really exists. And so from that perspective, which is quite a detached and depersonalized perspective, you find people are not very connected. If someone's suffering, they tend to just, the standpoint, which is where they are in the process, is that's not real. It doesn't exist. The painful circumstance is just illusion. Your idea about it is illusion, which is not entirely off the mark, but it's tended to swing a little bit too much to one extreme. And that tends to be how change happens, when a deep pattern is broken. The organism tends to swing to the opposite extreme, and there does need to be some readjusting, some balancing to a middle point. And in an integrated way of living, which would be what I would say the tail end of the seeking process is an integration of those realizations. In an integrated way of living, we come back to living as the human being in a world of time and space and form, where as if it's real, because in experience, it very much is an experience of form. Now, the deep seeing into the nature of experience can, when it's not so balanced, can create an overlooking of what's actually here in the experience. It's almost like a lack of interest of of what's happening on this level, and just interested in being the formless witness of everything, which is not at all interested in the detail, but rather in the big picture. And from that point of view, the actual feeling of free will, which is still there in the experience, is overlooked and in fact denied, because it's not understood at what is being pointed at when it's saying, but there is a feeling of free will. And that seeker is so fixated on the fact that they have seen that there is no doer, that, and the distinction between and free will hasn't, and the feeling of free will hasn't been made, because the witnessing, which is not interested in the detail, is there. A whole layer of life is overlooked, which means that the paradox of life isn't seen. It means that that seeker isn't able to acknowledge that in experience, even though they understand that in theory, everything is just a happening, in practice, they aren't able to acknowledge the apparent free will, which is or not even the apparent feeling, the feeling of free will, which is still very much there, because the concept that they have is that free will doesn't exist. And when a certain seeing of life, even what we could call an awakened seeing of life, can become a fixation in a way, can be a concept that we hold too absolutely, and it prevents us from appreciating a layer of life that still very much exists, that includes the undeniable feeling of free will. Because to that person that is saying, there is no free will, I'd say, go to your experience, and when you're sitting on the couch, do you feel like you are free to stand up at any point in time? And because the insistence that there is no free will because of what they've gone through is so strong, they will say, no, I don't, which is really them saying, I don't believe that I am the doer. I don't believe that there is anyone doing anything. And I say, but you're missing my point. Do you feel like you can stand up at any point? I'm not saying, do you believe in personal doership? I'm saying, do you feel like? And the focus on spontaneousness can even seem to cover up the feeling of free will. It doesn't, the feeling of free will is still very much there all the time, but attention landing on it, when the fixation and the focus is on the spontaneous happening, the focus on it can not happen. And for a long time, someone can keep insisting there is no free will. And I keep saying it's a feeling of free will in the moment. In the moment, don't you feel like you are free to order whatever you want on the menu? And the feedback will be, no, I don't, no, I don't. And one day, I'm sure they'll go, oh, I can't deny that even though I understand I can't order anything different to what I order, and I feel like I'm being lived even, I would go as far as to say I feel like I'm being lived, which is the attitudinal recognition that I'm being lived, even with a sense that I'm being lived, and yet I still have a feeling of free will in the moment.
Yeah, that clarifies. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't, you were cut out. Say that again.
Yes, that clarifies it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
I'm going to recall a recent experience, as in almost moments ago, and some of the thoughts that arose subsequent to that experience, not so much with a question, perhaps. I don't know how to frame the question, maybe is the problem. I think I say that always. But wondering if this sounds, wondering what it triggers for you. Yeah, leave it there. So my wife came in shortly ago and she's showing me her phone and she's discussing with me the articles that continue as she sees as hyped up news. And I'm hearing this as some discomfort that she's experiencing, which might mean that there is a projecting of a person who's uncomfortable. And she's asking me, do people really believe these news stories when clearly the thought offered comes with no proof of the statement? It's just an idea. And it's not just an idea, but it's one that is delivered with an intention to motivate a certain outcome. And she shows me an article that piqued her to leave her study to come out and share this with me. And it's about the head of some anti-masking movement who's now been found to have tested positive for COVID. And I guess she's saying this can move people to stay with the fear of which the masking seems to be so emblematic. So to her, a mask is a sign of someone who's not questioning the nature of mortal mind. So I asked her why that bothered her. And she said it doesn't. But I'm not believing her answer. So I continue. I asked her if she knows that people are actually believing or being moved by this news, by these thoughts. And she said, I'm sure some do. And I said, well, do you absolutely know that some do? And she said, yeah, pretty much. I even went a little further, asked her how that makes her feel to believe that some people believe such news. And we didn't get much deeper and the conversation ended. And then I'm thinking that it's like there's a movement in this experience, this happening, that's pursuing the issue in the manner as that happened. I'm still having attention, I guess I'm saying. I'm still having attention on this. It's past, I'm still there. Mind's putting forth something that's carrying with it a reflexive movement, like a mirroring to itself. Something which on one level, it is causing to notice something. That there's like a personal take projecting on her, that she is with a psychological response as a freestanding event. And then I'm thinking that this mirroring is to be noticed. I think that you're saying, and I'm not saying you're saying, I'm just thinking that you're saying, notice that, let it evolve, trust the process. Not much else to do besides allow ideas to flow. Life is presenting needed conditioning that might help the dropping of an attraction to individual doing. And if that contemplation sticks, then allow it to deepen or move. And that's it. That's life, just happening spontaneously. Even if there is a teaching there, even if you're lit up by the moment or turned on to keep figuring things out, just unless you're suffering by it. I don't know, has that triggered anything?
Well, in simple terms, I think what I see is there are going to be people that are, believing hype stuff. There's going to be those that think wearing masks is completely waste of time. There are going to be those that will go everywhere with a mask on. There'll be those thinking there's conspiracies going on. It makes sense that there's going to be all sorts of views and all sorts of reactions on top of those views, on a deeper level. I mean, the reactions of blame or hatred or judgment. It's going to be a wild mix in different for everyone. That's what, in each moment, we're all going to function according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it doesn't surprise me that there's a huge range of people believing stuff that probably shouldn't be believed, and there's a whole lot of people disbelieving stuff that maybe should be taken notice of. And so none of that, to me, is out of place. It's completely understandable. So if you've got someone that is doing really weird stuff, the attitude is, wow, that weird stuff is completely understandable. And so then your wife, and if she comes in and she's angry, let's say, about the way an article is written, it's like, oh, that anger makes complete sense. Might be completely different to how you relate to the article, because you might relate to the article and say, well, it's just ideas, I'm not going to buy into it or whatever. That's your way of relating. Your wife comes in and has a different attitude, and you go, that makes complete sense. So that's what I think is my 2 bits worth.
I think another part of the question is maybe harder to frame, and there have been so many times past now I'm addressing, which is probably erroneous, but that it seemed something I heard, and I thought you referenced this even today in something you said, a teaching. I think you had said the teaching could come from another person, it could come from a film, it could come from a story, and it's just sometimes all of a sudden I could walk by a TV show of I Love Lucy and hear something that just hits me, stops me cold. And it's almost as if life just gave a nudge and said, wake up. And I sit there a moment, but the moment's passed, and there's not much more to do with it than that. Kind of like I'm sitting here and we're talking, and I'm attracted to our conversations or to your discourse. Is that also a matter of just observing that there's a sense here that something's missing, and Roger may offer a way to get past that sense that something's missing. So it's just more the focus on maybe there's just too much thinking that life's trying to teach me something.
Well, it'd probably lead to a stopping if that's the case. So it serves its purpose, and then at some point we go, oh, let me just stop. But we can't stop till we stop, right? And we can't stop till we're ready to stop, which means maybe the thinking is needed in order to get us ready to stop. So I'm in favor of contemplating and thinking until it clearly has run its course.
I like that. Okay. Let's stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. So just a reminder that tomorrow is Sunday, so no satsang, and then next week there won't be any satsang, and I'll start again on the Monday, so in about 8 days' time. Thank you for joining, and see you then.